So welcome back. Hope everybody had a refreshing break, and hard to believe, but we are now moving into the final sessions of this international conference on AI with trust. It always seems to go so fast on the second day. And we'll now be, this is the dreaded post lunchtime slot, but we are definitely going to keep you awake by looking at a use case session that really is a central focal point for public hopes and fears when it comes to artificial intelligence. And you know the questions. Will robots free us from drudgery and boost productivity in a wide range of industries and services, or will they sideline humans? As machines take over tasks formerly performed by people, how can we evaluate and review AI-driven processes and outcomes? Same question we have posed elsewhere, but this is a question in this area that I think, again, does awaken a lot of public concern. And is human oversight always feasible? And how desirable is it? Those are some of the key questions that we'll be looking at. And once again, ladies and gentlemen, we're very eager to hear your questions and comments as well. You know the routine, I think, dear online audience. You can send them to us via our chat or Q&A function on the live stream, and otherwise we'll be taking questions once again from the room a little bit later on. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our outstanding speakers, and I'll start over there toward the right. Adil Amjad is Product Safety and Regulatory Engineer at Thermo Fisher Scientific, which delivers products and technologies to support scientific research. Welcome to you. Next to him is seated Viveka Bonde. She's partner at the Swedish law firm Bonde Barzey, which specializes in digital and IT law. Tell me one time how to say it right. Barzey or Barzey? Okay. And next to her is Ekkehard Ernst, Chief Macroeconomist and Future of Work Expert at the International Labor Organization, the ILO. And finally, it's a pleasure to welcome Mark Findlay. He's Director of the Center for AI and Data Governance at Singapore Management University. And we start out, as we did on the last two panels, with a use case, and you are going to present that for us. So please, the lectern is yours.
Thank you, Melinda, for the opportunity. Yeah, so today's use case that we're going to be presenting is regarding the cobots, and not working. Yeah. So when we talk about cobots, I think everyone is trying to understand what's the actual definition of a cobot. So a cobot is something, let's say, the robot working in close proximity to a human being, which means that they are not enclosed in barriers, or they are not, let's say, caged inside some specific safety area. So these are, let's say, really working alongside with you, more like they are working as partners with you. So if you take the definition from one of the ISO standards 10218, the collaborative operation, which states that in which purposely designed robots work in direct cooperation with a human within a defined workspace. So they're actually doing all the activities that a human being would do. And of course, I'm going to discuss later on how and what type of activities are they doing. An example is a robot waiter, which serves dishes to clients of a restaurant and recollects empty dishes. And then it's also doing, let's say, dull and dirty work as well. It's using the same space as a human being, and it interacts with restaurant people, personnel, and also, let's say, managers and all those kind of sort of things. Now, when we have, let's say, adding AI to such systems, it paves way for amazing opportunities. One of the opportunities that was foreseen was during the COVID-19 pandemic, as one can talk about, that there was so much concern and risk for human life. And I believe that if such systems were implemented at that point, it could have paved way for making, let's say, ensuring that the human life was also protected. They could have done risky tasks. They could have transported a lot of things or information to, let's say, patients, to doctors in that aspect. And also with regards to supply chain issues that were, let's say, existent in the past year, and this could have been tackled by AI cobots as well. we have, let's say, multiple stories in which some stories from US and also from India that came where cobots were actually supporting the local staff at hospitals. They were transporting food, medicines, and all those things. And sometimes they were also cleaning the floors for the hospital. So there was already an opportunity, but this wasn't discovered to that extent. Later, we will discuss regarding the trust and safety as well. So when we talk about opportunities and challenges with regards to economical and social sectors, as I mentioned, that cobots can substitute humans for 4D tasks that were identified: dull, dirty, dangerous, and delicate. Of course, they would ensure increased reliability, efficiency, and security as well. And also, as I mentioned, they're going to fill up the gap for the shortage of workforce as well. And when it comes to the challenges that we see, that there are quite a lot of, let's say, things coming up in mind, that will the robots in the future be, or let's say, are going to be replacing a human workforce? Because when AI is implemented, the robots are going to start to become smarter and intelligent with that kind of aspect. And that is basically a quite of concern issue for us. And when it comes to AI systems being implemented, there is a quite high risk on the safety assessments that we're going to do for the AI implemented systems. Because if they are not going to do or execute the job safely, then it's of course a threat to everyone around or in the surroundings. This also introduces new challenges with respect to verification and validation aspects for these type of systems. Then when it comes to the ethical and social impact, later our fellow panelists are going to talk in detail regarding this. There are also quite a lot of legal issues and challenges, workplace opportunities and challenges, and also standardization and how it can be tackled from a legal standpoint of view. And lastly, will compliance and product safety suffice? As mentioned, validation and verification of AI implemented system has to come out from a non-biased argumentation. So that of course is a big risk on that aspect. And when we're talking about compliance with legal requirements, standards for safety are important, but they will all alone not suffice to propagate the trust that has to come out in the community itself. And the necessities and preferences for for the community of the recipients needs to be addressed for the development phase onwards, meaning that it doesn't have to come out when the system has been developed and suddenly you think about, okay, what do we have to do with it? So this has to be addressed at earlier phases as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And as in other panels, let me ask each of you to get us started by talking about the risks that you are most concerned about. What risks raise particular red flags for you? We saw a great breakdown there between potential benefits or opportunities and risks. And I guess I'm asking here for a subjective perspective on that right-hand column, the risks, and on your own work that you've done in this area, what it indicates to you in terms of where the biggest concerns lie. And I'll start with Viveka and then circle back to you, Adil.
It's an interesting question that you pose, because you have various levels of risk. It depends on whether you look at it, for me personally, in a legal perspective, you have various risks and matters that you need to address. Not the least when it comes to division of liabilities, that's a risk. And also misalignment, the risk of misalignment of obligations, for instance. So of course you can go into the legal review perspective and you find various risks. And in addition to that, just subjectively, you also need to understand, I think from that perspective, that law is, of course, the main issue, but you need to have that extra layer of aid in terms of ethical and societal, the ethical and societal spectacles, basically. That's the risk. You need to be holistic in that way. You can't just look on one side of the matter at hand. You have to have a wider perspective. And I think the risk is to remind yourself of that, looking into a certain case, for instance.
And Ekkehard, feel free to speak to any risks, but of course, I think future of work is obviously within your mandate and of great interest to all of us, because that is has the potential for huge societal and political disruption, at least in some cultures and societies, not necessarily in all. We often hear, but again, this is for me somewhat anecdotal, and maybe you can confirm it, that Asian societies have a greater acceptance or trust in cobots and care robots, perhaps, than some other cultures. But you may be able to shed more light on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's certainly a truth to what you are saying. I guess the big thing here is really kind of to what extent are different countries exposed to different degrees of robotization and what type of industries and sectors they're specialized in. What's interesting is the discussion about risk, about losing your job. I mean, that's obviously on everybody's minds. Like, how do we kind of run out of jobs when we have all these robots coming into our workspaces? And what we see so far is actually those countries and those industries or firms that have used a lot of robots are not the ones that are shedding labor. The problem really is not so much at the individual job level. The problem is, does everybody get a fair share in terms of being able to work with these robots or cobots? And that's the big thing. That's you need a certain level of qualification, you need to work in a certain industry, and that's not always the case, in particular not in emerging and developing countries. Actually, what you do see is these technologies are mostly used in big companies, in multinationals, in the what we call the formal sector, so people with social security. And so all the other people, and this in developing countries is a majority of them, they actually never benefit from this technology. So the risk is not losing your job, the risk is being left out of this progress. I think what we do see in terms of the let's say the negative side of these developments is more at the workplace level. To what extent, and I think that comes back to the opening question that you had, to what extent is are humans in command in terms of driving how to use these technologies? So a lot of time you see that actually it's the machine that imposes the pace on you. And that creates enormous occupational safety and health risk, in a sense that you actually run after the machine and you're not in control anymore. We do see especially in logistics, for instance, that the accident rates in those companies, in those logistic warehouses where these technologies have been used extensively, is going up. So why? Because these machines impose their pace on workers in these warehouses, and people sometimes or often cannot follow. And so there is clearly an issue, like to what extent do you control what the machine is doing, or to what extent are you being controlled? So again, at the macro level, at the global, let's say, employment level, the problem is really the polarization. And at the firm level, at the industry level, at the workplace level, it's, are you in control of the machine, or is the machine controlling you?
Thank you very much. And that's definitely one where let's come back in a subsequent round to talking about where does the responsibility lie for mitigating those risks or challenges. So please, and finally from Mark, your assessment.
Yeah, I think it depends on which side of the laboratory door you sit. So if you're in the lab, the risk is about an empirical, rational risk about safety and robustness. If you're outside the laboratory, it might be something much more transcendental. Now, have you ever asked yourself why Siri has a female voice and why R2-D2 was cute? And the reason behind that is that when you transit the robot into the community has a completely different attitude to the way in which they see and think and understand how that will add to their lives, add value, whatever it might be. We've done some interesting work with the introduction of robots into geriatric facilities. And often the designers and the promoters are talking about the grip reflex, or the capacity for the robot to be accurate, to be reliable. In fact, what the older patients might be looking at is someone who might be a friend, someone who might replace the absent relative, someone who just remembers a song that they remember, that sort of thing. And so to some extent, I think the greatest risk in relation to robotics, well, there's two. One is being paternal and forcing robots into a world where they're not welcome. And the other is not thinking about the recipient community well enough to make them understand how they can push their priorities and preferences into the mix. Now, I remember Roger saying to us last night, what are the, the concrete outcomes of all of this? One of the concrete outcomes, as I see it, is to listen to the recipient community, but listen to them early, so that when you're designing the robot, designing the robot's application, designing the robot's location, it's not just you should accept this because it's good for you, but we're actually designing this because you're a co-creator of the robot's task, a co-creator of the robot's outcomes. And that will make for a world where we don't fear these individuals. I'll go back to something that Ekkehard said too. The greatest concern, and I think it's a very valid one, is job replacement. And, it's all very well to talk about cobots assisting people in certain areas where they don't want to do dirty work. But I wonder how often a promoter of a cobot goes to a co-worker and says, do you want a robot here? Good question.
Huh. Could you also just speak to the point that I made earlier about different levels of societal acceptance between different cultures? Because for you based in Singapore, I wonder whether you can verify that there is perhaps a somewhat greater degree of acceptance there than there might be in some Western countries.
I think there are two things in that question. One is the Asian preference for utility. So does this do a job? And if it does a job, then we like it. We don't sort of go behind the deeper questions about whether somebody else should be doing that job. But I think there's a second issue there which we sometimes gloss over, and that is that there are family, social, societal bonds that exist in Asian communities that are still very strong. And so if you're suggesting, for example, that the robot is going to replace the extended family, for example, then there'll be great resistance to that. But yes, it's true, because if you're looking at smart cities worldwide, the smart cities are in Asia, and that's where the technology has leapt forward. And I think to some extent too, because of the fact that, as in a question that I raised earlier today, that because the aging populations are such a huge problem in advanced Asia, and the reliance on migrant labour is going to have to reduce, then the human resource to be able to care and to be able to support in areas that we've previously taken for granted is diminishing. So it is a utility question, I think.
Thank you. And let me go back to Adil now to get your take on risks. You presented the comprehensive list, but if there was something in particular that kept you up at night, what would it be?
Yeah, it's from the product safety and regulatory perspective, is that when systems like these come into the market, are the product safety and regulatory engineers equipped with such knowledge to actually give the authentication that the system that has been designed is going to be safely used by or in the market? And if not, then that's a big risk that I foresee. And that's also the shortage of technical aspects within regulatory and safety. People are not coping up with that very well. They're not very much equipped with the knowledge and how to tackle those issues. And when that becomes, then you have a very big backlog of how these issues can be tackled. And then soon the industry keeps on developing further. And then you have a very big, let's say you're lacking in the standardization and validation process. And that I foresee is a big risk, that if we don't tackle this at this stage, then in the future, it's going to be let's say quite a big challenge on how to cope up with that.
We were talking in that last panel about the adaptation or alteration of technology in order to apply it in unintended uses. Is that something that can also happen with robots, or is there something about the design of a cobot, a robot, that would make that more difficult?
Well, I think from the beginning, the robots have to be monitored in such a way that the normal consumer becomes comfortable with the presence of such collaboration. And then slowly and gradually, once the acceptance is in place, then you can actually have unintended, let's say, cases. You can actually let them in close proximity for the normal consumer to have it, I would say. Yeah.
And if I can just skip back to Ekkehard again, Mark just told us replacement of work, in his view, is a very serious consideration. There is this perception that anything that can be decided with a yes or a no can be essentially handed over at some point to machine learning, to robots. Do you think that's right? Are we going to see vast numbers of also service professions automated in coming years and decades?
I think there's always a misconception in terms of, or misperception in terms of how these technologies are being introduced. I mean, no employer will wake up in the morning and say, oh, I have this new technology, let me figure out how to use it. It's rather like, I have a need, I want to be more productive, I want to be part of a certain supply chain, so there are certain standards that I need to respect. There's new regulation that I need to respect, so I need to make sure that my workplace has certain qualities. And most importantly, I don't find the worker anymore. I mean, we are facing a global population aging. So we're actually running out of workers. The thing will be, how will these technologies being used to replace that? And I think that a lot of people are not really aware of the fact that we are not using the technology to replacing existing workers. We're using the technology to replace those workers we cannot find. And I think that's a bigger concern, in the sense that we are actually, this population age, the demographic change that we're facing is much bigger concern, and the resulting maybe resistance, the cultural resistance to this, because people get older, the population is more reluctant to use this technology. I think that's a bigger concern than being concerned about losing a job. The point I was making earlier is that what the key issue for, especially for developing countries, is that they don't necessarily have all the skills to use these technologies. So they're in the middle somehow. The companies come in, they have all these fancy technologies, they want to invest in these countries, cannot make use of them. So they will actually have a smaller and smaller part of the workforce that is available there, that is being able to use it. And because of the connections between firms in advanced economies and firms in these developing countries using similar types of technologies, they will be forced to use technologies that are not optimal from their point of view. So in advanced economies, it's not so much an issue of losing your job. It's an issue about not finding the workers to do the job. And the workers that you could use, they can't use these technologies because they're not trained for it in developing countries to have access or to be able to use these technologies.
Thank you. Viveka, I had the impression you might want to weigh in on that.
Well, it's interesting to hear, because of course you have that fact with the aging workers, but I guess also the notion is that you can encourage different coexistence possibilities in the workplace. For instance, you can find very positive sides of dividing tasks between the machine and the human being. And as we have discussed throughout today and yesterday, the element of human controllability is of course of the essence all the time. So I think there are a lot of opportunities with promoting the use of robots in the workplace. Can be efficient, it can encourage sort of new collaborations, it can give life to various aspects of existing employees' working conditions. Used correctly, it can actually, I think, promote working environment. But of course, you need to have the guidance. We can talk about this on a high level perspective, but to really get down to how to do it, we need to be guided by some practical considerations and practices for achieving those goals, I believe.
Are we talking here about standards, or are we talking about something more like political guidelines or codes of conduct? Because clearly a number of the issues that you are all raising are in the realm of politics and social governance, as opposed to, as I understand it, purely verifiable standards. Is that right?
I believe so. I mean, you need to look at the spectra, I believe, from the very top to the bottom. And considering the poll we had yesterday, about the AI trust issue. It was interesting with 40% being unsure. I think it was 25% not feeling trust so far with AI. So that's a good question. Where are you supposed to put that mandate? Is it going to be bottom up or top to bottom? So that's an open question. It's a very important question to discuss.
And Mark, let's maybe start to talk about that question. That, of course, is the central topic of this conference. Who does what, and how do the different stakeholders work together? So if you take this apart, the different risks that you have all raised, which ones are amenable to being dealt with via standards and conformity assessment, and which ones are at a level of legislation or even global frameworks?
I think to answer that question, we have to be honest about why we're asking it. And to some extent, we have two paradigms going here. One is an economic paradigm, the other is a social paradigm. The economic paradigm is to say, all right, we're doing this because we want to have a profit value. I was just thinking as we were talking earlier, if you look at telephone banking, the way in which the delivery of banking services has gone. You used to go to a bank, you'd talk to a teller, and you'd get your answer. Then you had to stand in a queue and get a ticket, and you'd eventually get to a teller. The third was you got sent to an offshore phone service, which was usually in some third world country with lowly paid labor, and now you have a chatbot that you really can't speak to at all. The whole concept of the social has moved because of economic imperatives. Now, I think a very great risk there is the risk of disenchantment, that people are just going to get annoyed, they're going to get disconnected, they're just not going to want to be involved in simple things like asking questions, making complaints, whatever it might be. So that risk of disenchantment is so important. And if the robots become part of that devaluation of labor, devaluation of social contact, then we're in a really serious problem, because it's a bit similar to the world that we live in with social media, that if we are going to build our relationships around a smartphone and not around a dinner table, then that risk is huge. Now, I see the positive side of this being that robots can absolutely support, particularly, as Ekkehard was saying, in areas where we can't find people to do things. But we don't want to put robots into places that simply mean that others who were there can't be there, and then blame them for not being smart enough or not having the tech savvy to go on and be someone else. So my concern would be that the failure for the social and the economic to come together, and the fact that there is a creation of a disenchanted society,
Right.
which robots become part of.
And I have to say that when Ekkehard was talking about the idea that robots are often additional, they are not replacing, they are actually fulfilling functions for which we couldn't find. There are a lot of studies that show that that's often the case with migrant labor as well,
Absolutely.
that it actually fills gaps. And yet we've seen enormous backlashes fueled by populism against migration, even where the facts show something different. So again, that goes to this very, very controversial political, social component in this whole debate. Let me jump over to Adil to talk also about the levels of how we address this, because again, that is the key question. So in your view, and you gave us a very comprehensive look at some of the challenges, how do you see the approach to getting on top of these? Who can drive what part of it?
Well, I think starting from the basic level, I think the manufacturers would be the first one to start with when they are introducing such systems. They're going to look over towards what type of standardizations are in place to start development of such systems. And that's where they're gonna have the biggest, let's say, blocking issue, because At this moment, if, for example, I have to go back to my company and start saying, okay, we're going to design something and then we're going to implement AI on it. And then they're going to be asking, okay, how are we going to do that? Do we have standards in place to do that? Do we have some checks on how we're going to validate that? Are we going to verify that? So that basically comes from that level on who will define what needs to be there on the basic level. And then from there onward, start on going into the lower level on the framework development, because I believe that the framework is something that can be used all across the industries. And if there's a common framework, I think the applications can be defined accordingly on that aspect. Yeah.
So can you just say a word about within your company? Are there areas where you would say there are particular gaps here and this needs to be addressed quickly by standards bodies?
Yeah, I don't think so. I'm able to comment more on that at the moment, but I would see that it would be a very interesting discussion to come up with if they were actually looking into this. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Viveka, how would you allocate responsibility here? You talked about the issues of liability, for example. That seems to some degree more clear cut, or not necessarily, because again, we have a bifurcation in a way between the designers of the technology and the appliers of it.
Well, the difficulty when it comes to the issue about liability is that it can be quite unclear for the developers or the users who is going to do what. For instance, we have, I don't want to be geographically sort of to the point, but we have various frameworks in certain jurisdictions where you put forward, for instance, a risk assessment approach in terms of technology. You put obligations to that respect, for instance, on developers, and that's good. But then at the same time, I mean, AI and robotics, it's not, it's part of an umbrella of governance and law. So then you find yourself within a collaboration, within an AI value chain, you have various stakeholders with responsibilities. And when it comes to data governance, for instance, you have put obligations on users controlling the data. So what you have there is you have various obligations that have to be met by various stakeholders within the AI value chain. So coming to answer your question, I believe it's really interesting what we are discussing today, the importance between the various parties and in particular the legislator, but also the standardization officer and institute, collaborating, complementing each other. Because when it comes to law, we all know, and that was mentioned yesterday, it is a slow process. It's supposed to be a slow process. That's the beauty with law. And as we all know, technology like AI is not slow, it's the opposite. So we have to be street smart in that sense. We have to be practical, not losing the mandates, not losing that side of it, but looking at the different guidance, you can say, where you can see standardization as a complement, giving directions and filling in the gaps, giving guidance to the various stakeholders. I think that's a very good approach. The end result of that will also be very good for people like myself, lawyers, other compliance officers, actually getting the hands-on practical approach that we all aspire it. We know it's treading new grounds. That's a working issue in SC42, for instance, where you look at those issues. You look at it not only from a technical perspective, you also look at it in a, I would say, ethical and societal perspective. You don't look at it only in terms of ethics by design or the technology. You also look at it in an sort of on an organizational level, and I think that's very important. When you're supposed to regulate it, you need to look at both sides of it, and that's really ongoing work. So by doing that, you actually you get the ability to give more concrete advice, not only high level. We need to work ourselves. We need to filter the advice down to the stakeholders. I can continue and continue, so I better stop. But that also requires people being engaged. I don't believe in having competing standardization.
Which we talked about in the last
I don't
panel,
believe in that, with respect. I believe it's better to be on the same on the same path together. I believe to get to raise those poll votes we had yesterday, I believe it's certainly very important not only to talk to the organizations, to talk to to the big companies, to talk to the governmental bodies. I believe it's just as important to talk to the small and medium enterprises, to address the concerns of the consumers. And that to be able to do that, we need to work in that smart way of finding the synergies between law standardization with the end result that the conformity assessment can be done in a smoother and better way. And that's really ongoing work right now that's happening in NC42.
And let me jump over to Mark, because you talked about also bringing in the communities in order to build trust, which, by the way, also was a point that Bao Ying made earlier today. So how does their voice enter this? Is that purely at the applications level once the technology is?
No, not at all.
Right.
I mean,
so when, how?
I'll tell you, we've got to reverse the discourse, because previously it's been a discussion about getting all of the commercial, governmental, standardizing stakeholders together in one room, work out all the standards, and then go out to people and say, look, this is terrific, go and trust us. And they don't. You know, you've just got to look at the vaccines in relation to the pandemic. A significant proportion of the community saw the science. They were not stupid, but they just chose not to believe it or not to follow it. The 4 stars on your washing machine, people don't buy the washing machine for the 4 stars. So if that's not working, then standardizers, policymakers, and those who wish to have a rational debate, a safe debate, a debate about risk-free, need to go outside their comfort zone and start talking to people. Now, how do you do that? You reverse the discourse. What you do is you get communities into the room. Now, people often say, oh, how do you get a community to talk to me? How do you get people who are otherwise disinterested to talk to me? They will talk to you if they believe you're going to listen. And we've found this in the work that we've been doing. We've got a program called AI and Community. And AI and Community is designed around one simple idea, that AI develops trusted relationships with people. And that situation is about social connection, it's about relationships, and it's about the way in which we listen to the recipients and what they desire and what they need. Now, that's the best way of determining. I was thinking about the AI, the EU AI Act, for example, and certain areas in which AI should not be deployed. I agree that there are certain areas in which AI should not be deployed, but that's not for lawmakers. That's for communities to tell lawmakers about where they don't want AI. And I think that that's part of the problem. The stakeholder coming together stuff, how are we going to get together and talk to each other, is a great discourse, but don't leave out the rest of those who are actually going to benefit from this simply because we think it's good for them. And to finish off on that, if we believe that that's too difficult, then democracy is dead, because that's how democracy is supposed to work.
I was thinking while you spoke about analogies to the involvement of patient advocacy groups in large, for example, pharmaceutical trials, that there's no point in designing a trial if people aren't going to be able to use it. Ekkehard, I saw you making notes when Mark was speaking. So I have a similar question to you, but perhaps you also wish to address what he said. But my question to you would be, you've talked a number of times about the risk that developing countries could fall behind as this technology is moving into place. How do we bring their voices into this? And also, how do we who can work with those countries to ensure skills development or whatever it takes that does not occur?
No, it's a great question. By the way, before I answer that, just wanted to react on what Viveka is saying. I mean, I think when listening to you, I'm not concerned at all that we're running out of jobs. You always have a job for a lawyer. I think that's, but having said that, I think that it's indeed a very important question, not only to make the impact assessment ex ante, so before we introduce the technology, but also understanding what's happening afterwards. I mean, this whole idea of a post-market assessment, and as you said, not only like in the abstract, but really concretely on the ground in different countries. And so I think that the key point here is to create the right environment for that. And it's not easy. It's like you have public bodies that can do that. If at the EU level, we have seen already this regulatory activity, we don't necessarily understand exactly where we need to look at. And one of these concerns that I always have is, and I wanted to illustrate this with the cobot example earlier, is that you actually, by having these feedback loops in the system, you create additional risks by employing these technologies at scale. So in the cobot example, in the logistics warehouse, for instance, what happens is that the cobot will pace you as a worker depending on some kind of standards that is being built in. The standards will change over time as people using these technologies. You will end up essentially working at the pace of the fastest worker in the warehouse, which is not necessarily addressed to. So how do you assess this ex ante? You can't. You can only make an assessment ex post. And then the question becomes, who is actually making this assessment, what's happening? And in developing countries, we don't necessarily have all these bodies. So we need to create the space at the regulatory level that these kind of assessments can be made, but also we need to bring in the voices of these different communities, helping them to get access to this. And I think this is, especially for UN organizations, a key challenge to leverage these community voices into the discussion.
Thank you very much. And on that issue of working at the pace of the fastest worker, obviously in societies where there are strong unions and perhaps a works council, that would be a governance issue for the company itself. But that, again, is by no means available in every culture or in every workplace.
No, not at all.
Adil, let me go back to you again to talk a little bit more about how you see, you talked about the standards side of it. What about this overall governance or ethical side? How do you see that interplay with the other levels that we're talking about?
Well, I think Viveka and Ekkehard are much more equipped with the ethical side on that aspect. But when we're talking about standards, from, let's say, from the technical standpoint of view, I believe that they would serve as a very critical and important point for the development of such systems. And on the ethical side, it also comes up to the point on the general acceptance of such systems by, let's say, the normal community, and also when manufacturers are developing these things, are they taking into account the general public opinion for such things? And I think that's where it's going to start with.
Thank you very much. I'm not reading text. Well, I am reading text messages, but they're from Sylvia over here, and they are actually conveying to me audience questions that have been posed. So two of them are about developing countries and the risks of mass unemployment there. Ekkehard, you have addressed it to some degree, but the question is very directly, developing countries are presently facing a serious problem of unemployment, which to a large extent translates into security challenges. Don't you think the use of this technology will make even more people unemployed and worsen the challenges?
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, I think that the problem in these countries often is not unemployment as such. There are very few developing countries have large unemployment or high unemployment rates. What these people have is they need to find some livelihood, so they kind of end up as street vendors or in some kind of informal employment situation, and actually being totally disconnected from market work in this sense. So that is certainly a problem. And as I said before, it's
it's self-reinforcing. So these people are disconnected from formal employment. They don't get skills. They don't get the training. They cannot use these new technologies. They're getting further and further away. And that's a tendency that has happened way before the introduction of robots. And that is really a challenge to work together with these countries. My colleagues in our skills branch, they're working intensively with countries to actually help them develop vocational training systems that can cater to these type of issues.
Mm-hmm. Mark, you wanted to speak to
I was
that?
just going to say that I think the issue isn't so much about unemployment in developing countries, it's the fact of devalued labour. And the fact that even when people are employed in so many countries in the world, their labour is undervalued. Now, with undervalued labour, you're not going to replace undervalued labour with robots. Why would you bother? Because you've got cheap labour. And I don't think we're going to see a huge incursion of robotics into the South world, except if the North world is uncertain about the reward of undervalued labour from the South world. It's that dissonance between the two. Where you're going to see it is in countries like Singapore, where the tyranny of poverty have kept undervalued labour coming in as migrants. And as you rightly pointed out earlier, well, that's an unsustainable workforce. We get rid of those, we put robots in. What impact does that have on their home countries? And the whole idea of repatriating support income, that's going to mean that there's going to be a real shift in the impact of poverty, I think, because of that. And that's not the robot's fault. That's the fault of the way in which we've chosen to structure our global labour force. And that's where we need to start thinking about undervalued labour and thinking about the value of replacement. How does that all work?
Thank you. Other questions from the audience in the room? I see one in the back. I think it's Sally. Go ahead.
Yes, well spotted. Hi. I'm sorry, I just have to go back to the question of job losses, especially in developing countries, because I'm not quite sure I grasp the argument of no risk of job losses, especially in things like offshoring type of industries. I'm thinking call centers, I'm thinking outsourced manufacturing and so on and so forth, that rely on multinationals setting up operations in developing countries using relatively skilled labor, but still in labor intensive industries. And I'm struggling to understand how an employer might not want to automate away these jobs that come with a certain amount of risk and certainly with a lot of investment in setting up operations overseas, when they can simply replace them with AI systems or robots that cost a fraction and don't pose as much risk. And then it doesn't become anymore a question of upskilling or educating people to be able to cope with the technology, because you won't need them at all, or maybe you only need a fraction of them. But it also does become a straight out replacement of existing jobs and not being able to fill new ones, so replacing those new jobs with machines. So was wondering if you could just elaborate, maybe Ekkehard, maybe someone else, on that point, and how, whether you still don't see a risk of job losses in those cases. Thank you.
Please get us started, Ekkehard, and then whoever else would like to weigh in.
Let me give you an example. I mean, let's take India. India is a huge country, 1.3 billion people. The organized sector, so those people which we would equate to ourselves to, is like 10%, 15% of the workforce. So very small. Most people don't work in the organized sector. They work in rural areas, employment. They're never in touch with any of these technologies. So they don't lose a job. There might be some companies who decide at the end to not go to remove the work that have been doing in India and go back. The problem in these countries is not so much that these companies kind of trying to substitute labor with machines. The problem is that these companies don't even come in the first place. African countries have the big problem. They're not part of not at least to the same extent, not part of the global value chain. So these companies are never there. There are very few companies. The share of employment in these countries is very small that could potentially be replaced. And part of it has to do with the fact that most labor there is not at the skill level. We actually have statistics, if you want, on our website that shows you the extent to which under-education is a huge problem in developing countries, much more than let's say in advanced economies. And so these companies never come. And that's exactly the problem. Then there is not employment that's being created. Partly, as I said before, because of these technologies require basically to use the same technology in developing countries as we use here for quality reasons, for compliance reasons, etc. So they actually can't use this. This is the drama, if you want, of developing countries. These companies can't even use the cheap labor that they have. They would love to, but they can't because of technological reasons. So the problem is really this polarization in terms of not being able to access the global labor force. And the good, in a sense, the good thing now with digital labor platforms is now you actually have the possibility. You can actually access part of the labor force in India, for instance, through digital labor platforms, through Amazon, Mturk, etc., where you have very small tasks that allow these people to generate a bit of revenue that is comparable, let's see, to what you would get in advanced economies. So the problem is really not losing jobs. The problem is not actually getting access to these high quality jobs.
Would anyone else on the
Yeah, I was
panel?
just going to say, I think the call center example is really salient here, because if I make a call to a bank in Singapore and the robot or the chatbot doesn't work sufficiently, and they usually don't, so that's evidence of the robot not working, I end up in a call center in the Philippines. And the call center in the Philippines can usually deal with the issue much better than what the chatbot could have done. Now, why I ended up in a call center in the Philippines with usually very proficient, very clear, very attentive English-speaking Filipinas is because they work at half the salary of anyone in Singapore, and people in Singapore wouldn't do the job anyway. So to some extent, the failure of the robot is proliferating jobs in the South world. My concern really is not so much the failure of the robot, it's the fact that the Filipino call center workers are on PIN money. And so they're not getting a decent wage, which enables them to be creative and innovative and to do the things that you would want them to do. So I think really, to some extent, the question is not so much robots replacing them, but us starting to revalue labour and to do that in a more effective and efficient way. And I think the call centre analogy too really shows that at this stage, service robots are not very good. They don't work all that well. They don't do things all that effectively. And even though we would want them to do a whole range of different things better, and they may well in 10 years, at the moment they're not doing it. And so perhaps we have a little bit of time now to augment that drift between the use of undervalued labour and the replacement with robots.
Adil, how fast do you think we will see robots improve? You know, anybody who's seen that famous DARPA film from around, what was it, 2014 maybe? Where they were falling down, it looked like they'd all, you know, had way too much to drink. They couldn't get their little claws around the doorknobs. It was pretty pathetic. That has changed a lot in the space of what, 5, 6, 7 years. So how much do you think we're likely to see further improvements? Are we talking about an exponential process?
Yeah, I believe that there's going to be, of course, an exponential process on how the development is going to come through. And of course, this topic is becoming more and more discussed. So there is slowly going to build up a demand for these type of, let's say, systems to be coming in the market quite often. And slowly and gradually, we're going to be learning a lot from the implementation, starting from the basic aspects. And I think, yeah, it's going to be quite exponential and quite quick on the introduction of these type of systems in the market. Yeah.
Thank you very much. A slight between the lines warning there that the amount of time perhaps isn't, the window perhaps isn't that long. Who else has a question in the audience? I'm not seeing any hands go up at the moment. I have another one online, and it is this. And I think maybe I'm going to send this one over to you, Adil. I have an impression that they're asking you to name names of companies, which you may not want to do, but maybe you can find a way to answer anyway. It's this. Are there already existing manufacturers of AI technology who have adopted basic fundamentals in functionality, effective performance, and safety measures adequately followed in compliance with existing standards? If yes, says the questioner, we would like to know the manufacturers of this software to get the trainings necessary to deploy such software to serve our purposes in order to create awareness and sensitize our community and promote trust.
Well, that's a very long question. As far as I'm aware, there are quite a lot of manufacturers who are, let's say, developing, let's say, AI-based cobots. And with respect to software, I think that's also something that I'm trying to investigate as well, that if there is a manufacturer who is actually implementing some safety softwares for these kind of systems. But I think if we have to follow the, let's say, the current framework, I think we might get to start with the basic aspects, and slowly we have to learn from that. Yeah, I don't think so that I have any names at the moment. No.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that or related points? No. So looking out toward the audience again, go ahead, please.
About labor, I have mine of One Goal Initiative. Firstly, on the one hand, it was said that the tech is not able to reach most of the people anyway, but on the other hand, it was added that the tech actually reaches it because these people then can provide little tasks that would bring them some money. And then on the other hand, it was also said that the problem is that there is too little value given to jobs. And I would also say that if the value given to jobs is too high, then they will be automated more rapidly because they will, the automation will offer an advantage, a financial advantage sooner. So there's a really fine line between having too high value and too little value. You can't have too little values because they couldn't live properly, and then you can't have too high a value because they couldn't live at all, because they would be replaced. So what do you think, anybody, about this? Mark?
Yeah, that's the Paul Krugman argument, which is a bad job's better than no job. And I think that while I can see the short-term economic sense in that, if we were to develop a robotic world which was around the value of labor, then we're missing the point. Because the issue about the value of labor has been a question, and this is Ekkehard's realm, not mine, but has been a question way beyond the last industrial revolution. And we haven't dealt with that problem effectively pre-robot. Now, I think the issue should be that we deal with the value of labor here, which is interestingly becoming more and more complex, because in some parts of the world, there's little labor. In other parts of the world, we're awash with labor. But the other issue in terms of robots is not so much put a robot in there and save money, but rather put a robot in there and create a more productive and harmonious work environment. And if that was the way we're working, if that's what we're looking for, then we can actually use technology to improve life space. And this is something that I think is so important, that if we can slightly shift the argument away from risk and danger and job replacement and, you know, cheaper this, and onto something which was a more creative life space. And the best we've come up with is some of the banal improvements through, you know, the Internet of Things, so I can turn my kettle on before I drive home. This is really not what we should be thinking about technology for. but rather using robotics in certain situations where they're absolutely necessary and they can create a better world. And certainly the discussion we had earlier today about the provision of health services, it's absolutely crucial in all parts of the world that robotics has an effective role to play, because there isn't enough human services and there's an older population. So that's about creating a better world and not necessarily screwing down poor labor, which is, you know, the basis of your concern, I think.
That's quite an interesting way to think about, if we're trying to figure out priorities, what do we need to work on first, instead of looking at where are the biggest risks and what do we need to possibly, where do we need to draw a red line? You could ask, what are the priority areas for human benefit? And that may be our area, those are areas where we need to.
Absolutely. I mean, lawyers, unfortunately, and I'm one of them, look at the bad case when things went wrong. And so we've got to try and fix up the holes, rather than, as Roger and I were saying over dinner last night, you know, 80% of all contracts are performed. Do we ever talk about what makes them performed? It's called trust. Now, the conference here is about trust, and trust is about making things work, not fixing up things when they don't work. And I think in some respects, robotics can play a really fantastic role in that if they're designed to complement things that work, not to try and patch up things that don't work or cheapen things that are in a bit of a mess. And I think that that's a challenge for the designers and the promoters and the sponsors to look for a productive space for the debate, so that robots should be talking about improved life quality rather than necessarily cheaper economic gain, which will not necessarily produce that same quality.
Adil, in a way, what we're hearing is look at that left-hand 4D as a central driver of how we approach this, rather than the right-hand, caution sign. Would you agree? Is that something that you could imagine being a useful guideline?
Yeah, I believe that that could be a useful guidelines for such development, because as Mark mentions that the conference is stating AI with trust, so something has to develop over there. We have to give the confidence to normal consumers that something is eventually going to come out and it's going to be beneficial in the end. Of course, the idea behind is that we're not here to, or we're not going to be able to, I would say that we're not going to be replacing the work and the labor force over here. We're going to be actually assisting them in those kind of the 4D tasks that they're going to perform. That's going to make, of course, the ensure safety of the general population as well, where work was becoming difficult, especially in harsh conditions and environments and segments like mining. And over there, these type of cobots or these type of systems can be very beneficial, and they could eventually be a source of support to the consumer, to the companies, and manufacturers can eventually further develop on towards learning and gathering information and data sets from that kind of aspects. Yeah.
Thank you. I have two more online questions, Ekkehard, that I would pass on to you. One of them is what Mark just called the Paul Krugman argument of not so good jobs are better than no jobs. This question says, do you not think that less work time should be a goal and not the other way around? Do you really want children, women, and men to continue to be exploited? Don't you prefer less work for everybody?
Well, I mean, this is definitely a goal that we have in our mandate, that we want to make sure that there's an equal share in the national production that countries have, and that this being shared either through higher wages or through less working time, definitely. And I think that there are, this is essentially boiling down to the negotiation at the firm, at the sectoral or the national level between social partners. It's not something that the ILO has. I mean, we have a maximum. The idea would be a maximum working week. And that's enshrined in law in many countries, but it's not something that the ILO will decide through its governing mechanism. But I just want to come back to this question before about where do we create value? And I think that the key issue here is the way economists look at these things is that workers produce a certain output, a certain value, and they could get a certain wage for that. And as these kind of the difference between the two grows bigger and bigger, so you can And so as your productivity, if you want, increases, you also can command a higher wages. And typically the way it works, it feeds back, companies make profit, they kind of, there's a certain level of development in an economy, and then you essentially can have access to better skills, to better training, etc., and you can command a higher wage. So in this sense, as I said before, the key point really is how to bring countries that are currently left out of the global value chain into that discussion, into this, if you want, the global circular economy. And I think that's the key point here, that how do you make sure that these countries, that these people in informal employment, in the unorganized sector, can actually benefit from the global economic development? And for the moment, that's not the case. And so that is the key point here, that we actually need to find ways. And this is not done at the firm level. It's not done through technology itself. It's a whole process at the national level through a national development strategy, etc. And that's what we saw in East Asia, for instance. I mean, Mark can testify to that. If you look at South Korea, if you look at Singapore, so these countries eventually develop out from a relatively low tech base into higher and higher tech because of this kind of positive spin, this positive circle of getting into higher and higher value added activities. And this is exactly what we need to find for those countries who are currently at the lower level of economic development.
Thank you very much. One more online question. I'm going to pass this to Mark and Viveka, and probably that's going to take us through to the end. But it does seem to me, I'm coming back again and again to Roger's question that he posed in the first use case session today about who does what at what level. And it does seem to me that in every single use case session we've done, we've seen a number of political and governance issues that preceded AI, that are basic levels, as Ekkehard also just said, about how do we triangulate different goals within our economies and our societies that also have to do with equality, value of work, and a host of other issues. And this question, in a way, goes to that again. It says, a big country like India has to face the labor challenges of an on-demand economy with flexible jobs, transient wages, and distributed risks. There are three major areas in labor policy that require attention in the coming years: reskilling workers, rethinking social policy, as well as re-examining employment potential of new sectors. How can these issues be resolved for such countries? So what we're seeing is AI is setting something in motion or catalyzing discussions that we've had for decades, for centuries.
Well, I'll be quick on this because I could take the rest of the day and tomorrow, but I won't. The answer is a thing called participant self-regulation, which is that if you're going to have a transition in an economic model, such as we've had with disruptive economies, which were supposed to rejuvenate society over the last 20 years, and in fact have been proven to be a fraud, but that's another story. If you want to have a new design for your economic realm in which people can participate more effectively, bring those stakeholders into that regulatory debate who are the most vulnerable. And that can be done. I mean, we've seen it recently with the Uber discussion about whether Uber is an employer or is not. The courts have had some determination of this, but it's created a situation where the drivers and the customers have had a role in the self-regulatory model. Now, even in those countries where people have diminished power and very little voice in labour force, there are ways of opening up participatory self-regulation models where you will find things work because vulnerable stakeholders are involved. And that, even if you are the biggest cynic in the world, that makes money, because basically what you have is a more satisfied and a more productive workforce. And the models are there. They've been developed, they've been discussed, they're there. Lawyers discuss them, sociologists discuss them. That model will, I think, open up the opportunity for that sort of thing.
Viveka.
Yes, I can only agree. This is a very good final discussion, because that's exactly what it's all about. You need to include all countries, all stakeholders into this debate. And we have a brilliant example of that in SC42, where you have the ethicists, you have the advisors, you have the technicians, of course, and you have people in various different professions from various different organizations discussing these issues. Because it is a fact that AI doesn't know any legal boundaries. it's not limited to any such boundaries. So the discussion has to be on that inclusive level, and that, I guess, is the only way to really achieve tangible results that we also understand and that we can start using to create practical practices and considerations that we can literally use and apply.
Thank you very much.